Why would the most powerful man in the world be starved to death? In Chinese history, nearly half of all emperors did not die of natural causes. Many of them didn't die on the battlefield, and they didn't die from illness either. Instead, they died in ways that are almost absurd, hard to believe, even a little darkly ironic. Some were struck by lightning, some literally ate themselves to death, some were starved to death by their own sons, and some fell into a toilet and drowned. It sounds made up, but every single one of these stories is real. I'm Jason, and this is A Different Story. Today, we're going to look at a few real cases to see how Chinese emperors actually died. Make sure you stay until the end, because the last one might completely change how you see what it means to be an emperor. An emperor executed by lightning. In ancient China, people believed that if someone became so arrogant that they no longer respected the gods, punishment would eventually come. And according to historical records, something like that may have actually happened. King Wu Yi of the Shang dynasty was known for his extreme arrogance. He didn't just disrespect the gods, he openly challenged them. At one point, he had a wooden figure made and called it the heavenly god. Then, in front of a crowd, he shot arrows through it, declaring that he had defeated the gods. But that wasn't enough for him. During a hunting trip, he made an even more outrageous decision. He would challenge the real heaven god. He drew his bow to full strength and fired an arrow into the sky, as if he were declaring war on the universe itself. What happened next felt almost like a myth. The sky suddenly darkened, clouds gathered, the wind picked up, and then, out of nowhere, a bolt of lightning struck him directly. He collapsed on the spot and died in the wilderness. Later records describe him as the only supreme ruler in Chinese history clearly documented to have been killed by lightning. You could call it coincidence. You could say it was just a natural phenomenon. But to people at the time, it looked more like a response from the heaven god. And here's the thing. He wasn't the only emperor who died in a truly unbelievable way. An emperor crushed by a bronze cauldron. King Wu of Qin, known in history as Qin Wu Wang, ascended the throne at just 19 years old. He was a young ruler with enormous potential. In only a few years, he strengthened the state of Qin and demonstrated remarkable military and political ability. Many believed he had the potential to become a truly great emperor who could change the course of history. But in 307 BC, during a diplomatic event, he made a decision that would seal his fate. In order to display his strength and to prove that Qin was the dominant power, he decided to lift a massive bronze cauldron weighing around 200 kilograms. In ancient China, such a vessel was not just an object, it symbolized authority and legitimacy. This wasn't just a show of strength, it was a political statement. And at first, he succeeded. He lifted the cauldron, and everyone present was stunned. But the problem was, he didn't stop. He wanted to take a few steps forward to make the moment even more legendary, and in that instant, everything went wrong. He lost control. The cauldron slipped from his hands and crashed down onto his body. He died later that same night from his injuries, at just 23 years old. A ruler who might have reshaped history instead ended his life in a single moment of overconfidence, paying for it with his life. An emperor who ate himself to death. If the first two emperors' deaths still carried a sense of fate or accident, then this next story is pure absurdity, almost darkly ironic. His name was Liu Yu, known as Emperor Ming of the Liu Song dynasty. But before he became emperor, his life was filled with humiliation. Because he was overweight and loved to eat, he was openly mocked by his own nephew, the reigning emperor at the time. He was even locked in a cage and forced to live and eat alongside pigs, a royal prince treated like livestock. He endured this for years, waiting for his chance. When it finally came, he launched a coup, killed his nephew, and seized the throne. It should have been the perfect revenge story, a man rising from humiliation to absolute power. But the problem was, he didn't stop. Once he had power, he spiraled further out of control. He began to eat obsessively with no restraint at all. His favorite dish was fish soaked in honey, and he could consume enormous amounts in a single sitting, eating day and night without limit. In the end, this emperor, who had survived humiliation, taken revenge, and reached the top, did not die in battle, nor to political intrigue. He died from something far more absurd. He literally ate himself to death. He won power, but lost to himself. An emperor starved to death. If some emperors ate themselves to death, others met the exact opposite fate. They were starved. And this didn't just happen once. Emperor Wu of Liang, Xiaoyan, the founding emperor of the Liang dynasty, was once considered a capable and effective ruler. But in his later years, he became deeply obsessed with Buddhism. He repeatedly abdicated the throne to become a monk, only to return each time after officials redeemed him with massive donations to temples. This cycle drained the state's resources and gradually weakened his control. Eventually, a rebellion broke out. The rebels stormed the palace and imprisoned the 86-year-old emperor in a small room. No food, no water. A man who once ruled an empire was left to die slowly, alone, consumed by hunger. But if that wasn't cruel enough, another emperor's fate was even more chilling. Duke Huan of Qi, Zhang Xiaobai, one of the most powerful rulers of the spring and autumn period, had once dominated the entire region. Yet in his final days, as he lay seriously ill, his 5 sons were too busy fighting for the throne to care whether he lived or died. They confined him, cut off all supplies, and left him there. The man who once commanded the world was eventually starved to death in isolation, and his body wasn't even discovered until long after he had died. From the peak of power to absolute abandonment, it's a fall more brutal than death itself. And perhaps the most terrifying part is this: they weren't killed by enemies, but by the people closest to them. The emperor murdered by his own family. If the previous deaths sounded like accidents, then this story is a full-blown Shakespearean tragedy of power. His name was Li Xian, Emperor Zhongzong of the Tang dynasty. His destiny was entirely controlled by the 3 most important women in his life. His mother was Wu Zetian, the only female emperor in Chinese history. Her ruthlessness was beyond imagination. Only 2 months after he first ascended the throne, she personally deposed him and banished him from the center of power, beginning a brutal 21-year exile. During those 2 dark decades, Li Xian lived in a state of paralyzing fear. Every time he heard that his mother had sent a messenger from the capital, he would tremble with terror and even attempt suicide multiple times, convinced that the messenger carried a death warrant. But every single time, his wife, Lady Wei, would grip his hands, literally risking her life to stop him, promising that they would survive the darkness together. In those years of despair, Wei was his only anchor, his only reason to keep breathing. Finally, in 705 AD, Wu Zetian was forced to abdicate, and Li Xian miraculously reclaimed his throne. It should have been a perfect comeback story, but power is a drug that breeds madness. The woman who had shared his suffering and saved his life during exile, Empress Wei, returned to the peak of power only to find herself consumed by the same ambition as Wu Zetian. She wanted to rule the entire empire. Even more chillingly, their own daughter, Princess Anne, joined this feast of power. She too began to dream of becoming the 2nd female emperor in history. When Li Xian became the final obstacle on their path to absolute power, this mother and daughter made the coldest choice imaginable. According to the New Book of Tang, in 710 AD, Empress Wei and Princess Anne personally prepared a poisoned pastry and served it to him. The man who survived decades of exile only because of his wife's support ended up dying at the hands of that very wife and their daughter moments after regaining his crown. It remains one of history's darkest ironies. He survived his mother's ruthless tyranny, but could not survive the blind ambition of his own wife and child. Emperors who died from excess. Ancient emperors didn't just hold power, they had access to nearly unlimited pleasure. And for some of them, that lack of limits eventually turned into self-destruction. Emperor Xuan of northern Zhou, Yuan Yun, ascended the throne at just 21 years old, but quickly became obsessed with women. By tradition, an emperor could only have one empress, but he appointed 5 simply to satisfy his desires. To indulge himself without restraint, he abdicated the throne after just 1 year, passing it to his 6-year-old son, so he could retreat behind the scenes and focus entirely on pleasure. Even more extreme, he ordered a nationwide halt to marriages so that young women could be selected for his court first. Power in his hands became something completely out of control, and that lifestyle quickly began to destroy his body. Within a year, he died from overindulgence at just 22 years old, and he wasn't the only one. Zhu Zaiji, an emperor of the Ming dynasty, followed a similar path. During his reign, he constantly elevated new consorts, holding a new marriage every few months. He also ordered large numbers of young, unmarried women to be brought into the palace, to the point where families rushed to marry off their daughters early just to avoid selection. After only 5 years of this lifestyle, he too died from excess. This pattern repeats throughout history. Emperor Cheng of Han, Emperor Guangzong of Ming, Emperor Duzong of Song, Li Yuanhao of Western Xia. They had everything, yet lost the most basic sense of restraint. If you're interested in the more detailed and even more bizarre stories behind them, I've linked related shorts in the description below where you can explore further. Emperors who died for love. But not all emperors were destroyed by desire. Some were undone by the exact opposite, devotion. Emperor Chenghua of the Ming dynasty, Zhu Jianshen, spent his life devoted to one woman, Wan Zhen'er, his childhood nurse who was 17 years older than him. Despite having an entire imperial harem, he loved only her. Power, status, endless choices, none of it changed his loyalty. But when Wan Zhen'er died, this once decisive and capable emperor completely collapsed. He stopped governing, stopped caring about the empire, and spent his days lost in grief. Just 8 months later, he followed her in death. For him, what he lost wasn't just a person, it was his reason to live. Another emperor, Emperor Xiaowen of Northern Wei, Tuo Bahong, faced a different kind of heartbreak. He waited more than a decade to reunite with the woman he loved and finally brought her back to the palace, making her his empress. But what he didn't know was that she had already betrayed him. While appearing gentle and devoted in front of him, she was secretly involved with another man. When the truth was revealed, the emotional blow was devastating. Just 2 months later, he died of despair at the age of 33. Some emperors were destroyed by indulgence, others by love itself. If you want to see the full, more dramatic versions of these 2 stories, I've made separate videos for them. Links are in the description below. And what comes next goes even beyond absurd. An emperor who fell into a toilet and drowned. King Jing of Jin, a ruler during the spring and autumn period, fell seriously ill in his later years and once had a disturbing dream. After waking, uneasy, he summoned a diviner who cautiously told him that he might not live to see the next wheat harvest. In other words, he wouldn't make it to autumn. King Jing didn't believe it. As his health gradually improved, he became even more confident, and when the new wheat was ready, he decided to personally taste it to prove the prediction wrong. But on that very day, just before he could do so, he suddenly felt severe stomach discomfort and went to relieve himself, and he never came back. When his attendants went looking for him, they found that he had fallen into a latrine pit and drowned. A ruler who had survived illness and power struggles ended his life in the most ordinary and humiliating way imaginable, making it one of the most absurd and unbelievable deaths of a ruler in history. After seeing all these emperors and how they died, which one do you think is the most shocking or the most unbelievable? And the truth is, this is only a small part of real history. There are many more stories about royal deaths that are just as absurd and completely real. If you want to see more stories that are even crazier than anything you'd see in a TV drama, let me know in the comments. I'll make another episode. I'm Jason. This is A Different Story. See you in the next one.